Thank you for inviting me, and thank you to you, Kui, to have included me in this initiative of thinking about the future of cybernetics, which is always a kind of interesting and complicated question because both because of the future of have an image of the future that is not already manufactured for us by the what we could call capital AI, where everything, every kind of the image of the future as the image of thought has already been artificially generated and can be regenerated over and over again. But also I'm interested in the question of cybernetics, because cybernetics has a complicated history and the way in which we moved from a different, a kind of paradigm of cybernetic into a kind of critique of cybernetics, and how cybernetics is unfolded in computation, in kind of interactive intelligent systems today is another interesting history for which, doesn't, we already cannot have a kind of monolithic idea of cybernetics. My talk today is entitled The Cybernetics of No, and I'm just going to go and delve into it, hopefully the idea of the no, which is to some extent inspired by Gaston Bachelard, The Philosophy of No. Also, yeah, it's something that is we can I could develop some other time. So from generative adversarial networks which generate and transform image to the generation of text, from images, text, sound, one can argue that cybernetics is no longer what it was. If generative AI can not only reproduce images and sound, but also ideas, what kind of cybernetics can AI become? One way to address this question is the argument that the model of automation that cybernetics carries does not simply define the form and function of technical tools. Instead, with cybernetics, automation had already become and already come to coincide with techno-social operations, if only we think about the work of Gilbert Simondon, which are, as it were, synthetically enveloped in the machine, where the machine itself is no longer an automated apparatus or system, but is above all a medium. Machines, therefore, are not simply tools, namely means teleologically determined by use for purpose, but are, as it were, already constituting a field for onto-epistemological reconfigurations of social relations, as well as metaphysical possibilities. One can quickly suggest that machines have taken many epistemological forms and defined distinct modalities of automation, moving from the automation of thermodynamic flux to the automation of information, from the computation of reason to the social form of artificial intelligence. However, what is it yet to be interrogated is the following. If cybernetics as a form of socio-techno-genic automation appears to challenge the wholeness of philosophy by shifting towards the becoming organisms or the becoming thought of the machine, then can a speculative critique of technology avoid the risk of falling back into the very colonial, patriarchal, and racializing logic of capital AI? In other words, can the future of cybernetics envisage the abolition of this logic without re-imparting the authority of philosophy, or what Francois Laruelle calls the decisional structure of philosophy, according to which automation must conform to the given image that AI can have? Algorithmic automatism, according to Francois Laruelle, is definitely given in a finitary way. It entails a scientific transcendence and a meta-language corresponding to, and quote, a strictly machinic or technological type of AI form, end quote. While agreeing that this automated form requires the elaboration of immanence, it, however, needs to be placed with the concept of performance. The latter, this concept of performance, according to Laruelle, is also a criterion that explains how to identify thought and computation, except that the machine is expected to surpass human intelligence. It is here that immanence, according to Laruelle, is confronted with precisely the, end quote, the meaning of intelligence and of what it can do, end quote. What he also calls algorithmic transparency is another way to argue against the quantitative view of intelligence as that which measures the correlation between premises and results in terms of effects, or simply a logicless enumeration of ends, thus presupposing homogeneity between the syntactic and the semantic order. If for the classic model of symbolic AI, performance presupposed the conceptual categories, presuppose that conceptual categories could be programmed into artificial connectors, the inductive model of generative AI today also requires a concept of performance to explain how artificial neural networks learn to associate data with meaning. In particular, performance has the task of reiterating a direct correlation between the material, the syntactic, and the semantic in the name of a given or a priori decision, or what Larwell calls dualities. Here, intelligence is prejudged. It is caught into the decisional imperative that establishes its limits and goals so that it can be equated to a passive machine, a vessel for performance. Larwell thus claims that the scientific transcendence about intelligence is yet again necessary to establish and to reiterate, to ground the transcendence of philosophy. In other words, intelligence is first reduced to quantitative performance, and as such, it is secondly compared to what machines can do. This circular operation serves philosophy to argue that machine intelligence is never and could never surpass transcendental reason, deductive proof, and self-reflective judgment. Philosophy only uses intelligence, and quote, on behalf of a very special form of thought, probably irreducible to any numerical combination, end quote. In other words, one can suggest that the argument for the future of cybernetics, aiming to elevate machine thinking to philosophy, ends up offering yet another form of transcendence for philosophy to the extent that its horizon or limits correspond to a self-regulatory auto-positioning of philosophical decision itself. What appears as a logicless or abstractless performance of machine thinking therefore only serves to reinforce the superior performance of philosophy embedded exactly in this transcendental concept of performance. From this standpoint, this kind of imitation game between intelligence and philosophy, between automation and philosophy, and intelligence and reason, takes the circular form of an expanded transcendence, whereby the limits of self-reflective judgment are turned into the prosthetic extension of human cognition to machines, which is again set to justify the superior performance of critical decisions against the mindless mechanics of machines' performance. What we have here is the perpetuation of epistemological dualities between reason and intelligence, intellectual intuition and self-reflective thought, that belong to the same order of auto-positioning of being, namely defining the question of technology as the modern problem of the human. According to critical philosopher Sylvia Wynter, the invention of this modern biocentric being is key to the present techno-industrial capitalist mode of production. However, while the argument that the modern conception of man as originating from natural sciences intends to establish a series of epistemological discontinuities from the pre-modern metaphysical or no scientific order of nature to the secular one, Wynter insists that it is yet to be recognized that Western modernity rather exists on a continuum with such metaphysical order. In particular, the epochal constitution of what she calls man one as a political subject and man two as a bioeconomic subject is profoundly coded from within the specific secularizing reformulation of the grand narrative. For Wynter, the out-opposition of being and thought is embedded in the correlation of the image of God with the image of man, and it was epistemologically generated in the description of human reason as offering a standpoint above and beyond the world of the senses. The order of knowledge takes science to justify the transcendent decision about the limit of man. Within this framework, a new principle of non-hegemony comes to constitute, end quote, from Winter, a space of otherness, end quote, involving the projection of, end quote, an extra-humanly and imagined genetic substance, end quote, that defines the image of man according to the biocentric order that divides beings in two categories, those selected and those not selected by evolution. This fundamental paradox between those who are and those who are not selected to succeed or even exist, according to Winter, can be found in the Darwinian answer to the question, who we are and where do we come from? In particular, this paradox is derived from the clash between the descriptive statement that defines the human according to the philosophy of natural organisms on the one hand, and the ontological auto-positioning of this biological origin of man, as if being could be, in its ontological stance, could be independent from its description. This means that this biocentric formulation of the limit of reason must repress its own explanation, namely that it is based on a descriptive statement and thus on an ontological given that must be posed prior to knowledge. So machine thinking here is already set to perform the ontological decision of who we are and where do we come from using a biocentric epistemology, which AI intelligence mainly must reify. So how to overturn this critique of automation, which is always already caught in this auto-positioning of transcendence of philosophy? While algorithmic transparency establishes this correlation, this mirror image, this trick between philosophy and automation, which aims to establish the autonomy of being and thought and the Promethean ideal of freedom and liberation from its own medium, Laruel's notion of the transcendental computer rather can help us argue that automation is conditioned by a conception of instrumentality that carries within itself a model of enslavement, of surrogacy and fungibility of the slave. One should bring in conversation Laruel's critique of philosophical decision with Sylvia Winter's articulation of recursive epistemology to lay bare how generative AI envelops within itself the socio-techno-genic articulation of the servo-mechanic prototype of the slave. As I've written elsewhere, a speculative critique of automation today must ask this question: can a critical theory of AI, and by this also mean image of the future cybernetic, account for how the overrepresented cosmogony of automation principally relies on a servo-mechanic model of the medium? So I repeat, can a critical theory of AI account for how the overrepresented cosmogony of automation principally relies on the servo-mechanic model of the medium? At the same time, this critique must also ask how this argument that the medium or the machine carries within itself the prototype of the slave avoids to be complicit with the post-human vision for which other machines are extension of the slave condition of ontological exclusion, or that machines are an extension of the human. In other words, central to the speculative critique must be a theory of automation that challenges the post-human vision that replaces the material condition of enslavement with automated socio-techno-genic abstraction of the slave, the dispossessed, the fungible surrogate. This requires a refusal of the systemic model of philosophy as well, which affords the reproduction of its principle of instrumentality, where the materiality of the enslaved remains, after all, a tool of the master, which is designed to prescribe and preserve the rules of subjection at the core of racial capitalism. From this standpoint, one could argue that this equation between the enslaved and instrumentality could be also yet another mythification, sublimation, reification, and sublation or negation of the slave. This is to say that the slave remains a symbolic form without accounting for the material, historical, and ontological conditions of negation, for which the slave is caught within, end quote, the scene of subjection, end quote, where, as Adia Hartman explains, the law's selective recognition of the humanity of the slave rather canceled the captive's ability to consent or act as an agent, and only acknowledged the intentionality and agency of the slave in the form of criminality. In other words, this equation precisely may act to profess the recognition of machine intelligence and humanity, but yet preserves the agency of the slave and of the machine in the form of the outlaw, of the criminal. This is one way in which the nonlinear correlation of the slave with the instrumental condition of surrogacy, entailing this onto-historical violence against Blackness and Black people, can preserve the master tools, while instrumentality can just continue to do the work for philosophy and for critique. So how to avoid falling within this intellectual trap that reproduces precisely the dualistic model of critique, where abstract automation requires instrumentality to extract the material and thus reimpose the division between abstraction and the flesh? How can generative AI offer a speculative image in terms of abstraction without extraction? Is that even possible? One has to turn to the work of the Black radical tradition, Black and queer feminism, in order to articulate the possibility of instrumentality that questioned the radical undoes the patriarchal, colonial, racial logic of the separation and opposition between the symbolic and the real, abstraction and matter. A speculative cybernetics must not only refuse the form-matter dyad of transcendental decision and the project of becoming human, but also address negative instrumentality in order to undermine the authority of philosophy, which is rooted in the racializing and patriarchal logic of capital. From this standpoint, one can continue to ask, how can automation be non-decisional, i.e. not self-given in its self-reflective judgment? Laruelle tells us that automaticity is said to define both the presence and the absence of a subject. Automaticity is rather localized in what he calls a unification effect with philosophy. This implies not an inner theory of AI, namely the assumption that what machine does is equivalent to just task or thoughtless functions of its intelligence. Contrary to the grounding principle of cybernetics, Laruelle's visions of transcendental computer is said not to demonstrate the machine's intelligence corresponds to learning patterns that are determined by self-reflective feedback, which regulates inputs and outputs, and which are constituted by both necessity and contingency. Instead, for Laruelle, no structure can be constructed beforehand, neither a philosophical mode of givenness, nor an automaton simulating man. Instead, a non-linear and a heretic synthesis between philosophy and automation, the unification effect or their unification effect rather appears as what he calls a practical immanence or a lived immanence, involved a transformation not of the sensible and the ideal, or the visible and the sensible, or simply the metamorphosis of the internal time of the system, like the computational time, or the shift from the organic to the computational time. What this unification effect does instead is to leave marks on the word forms as it hacks it back at it. So the unification effect hacks the word form as it is. Namely, the effect generates within itself a space that obeys to no time. What appears in the effect, therefore, is what can only be determined in the last moment or the last lived experience, namely entailing a new phenomenal advancement which cannot be given in the philosophy machine schema of reference. According to Laruelle, philosophy has always flirted with technology to the extent that the latter is there to provide a shelter or a mirror of the limits of its self-determination. While on the one hand, philosophy transcendence denies the reduction of thinking to mere algorithms, on the other, philosophical transcendence relies on a degree of automatism. The mirror image between philosophy and automation instead precludes computation to become transcendental. It entraps automation in the scheme and structure or system of an already given consciousness. In particular, the machine is either there to manifest the interiority of consciousness, as if it were distributed in space. For instance, we find this in theories of emergentism and extended cognition. Or on the other hand, is there to become one with consciousness, like with the argument of neuroplasticity, where the neural structure itself is reduced to a set of algorithmic functions. So on the one hand, philosophy seems to flirt with automation in order to propose a pan-consciousness that aspires to preserve the centrality of the image of man in the mediatic instrumentality of the flesh, or speaking with Saadia Hartman, of blackness. On the other, philosophy takes as its own mission to shed light on what it is to have consciousness in the way that it elevates machine functions to perform a simulation of the neurocognitive structure of the brain, for which, according to which machine must become an image or revelation of the human. So Laruel's proposition instead for transcendental computer takes another route. This leads us to envision a unification effect between thought and computation. But how can thought and computation be unified without reiterating the magic trick that philosophy sets up for AI and computation? While for Laruelle, this seems to be a utopic practice that allows to bring forward immanence in non-philosophy, in my instance, in this instance where I'm interested in cybernetics or no, it also offers a vision for a critical automation theory that yet requires a radical articulation of instrumentality that refuses the overrepresentation of the servo-mechanic form of machines and AI. Here, immanence is not simply embraced in order to overcome the limit of philosophy, but rather needs to account for what can be called the negative reversibility of the real, namely defining the condition for which the real cannot be mirrored back into thought as a way, therefore, to break inside the recursivity of thinking. To start with, one could argue that Laruelle's transcendental computer aims to suspend this reversibility between the limits of philosophy and the limits of cybernetics, or in its form of automation and AI. Its intervention makes an effort to devise for us what he calls a unimaton. The challenge is precisely this reversible codependency of philosophy and automation. Instead, the unimaton presents a certain, and quote, detour of the machine, end quote, and from its mechanical inscription in order to shift its operation in this unified in the last instance theory of thought and computing. But this kind of unified in the last instance must bear in mind that we need to distinguish two types of automatism: the philosophical and the logical and the minimal form that Laruelle understands as unimatic, where uni must be understood as a first term and not as a unitary syntagm. The unimatic does not explain the recursive interiority of philosophical decision, or the contingency or the indeterminacy of the real come to mark the limit of self-reproductive stance of reason. Instead, non-philosophy takes the question of philosophy and computation to account for a radical unilateralism of logic that can only be determined in the last instance, in the last example. So it is possible to clarify this process of unification in terms of the concept of performance. But this concept of performance, as I've already anticipated, cannot just stand for the expansion of the limits of thinking in terms of what machines can do. So this is why philosophy can accept the machine can think, but only after what philosophy can think. So in other words, philosophy presumes to explain machine's intelligence by analyzing the kind of performance the machine can imitate. In this case, this is not an immanence in the last instance. And therefore, the concept of performance here only is reiterated in terms of function or as a teleological instrumentality. But against this kind of performance concept at the core of decisional structural philosophy, Laruelle argues that the concept of performativity and performance can be radicalized through what he calls performed without performation. And this is to reject the antithesis between reason and automation, between consciousness and AI, by rejecting the naturalization of technology into philosophy and rather push forward a reconceptualization of what he calls the performed without performation. It is here that non-philosophy or this model of the cybernetics or no that I'm attempting to develop takes us on a thrilling twist, insisting that the performed cannot be defined ontologically as what is or without what is. And as such, a theory of automation shall be troubling the very understanding of the very concept, the very statement of the becoming organisms of machines. The performed, therefore, allows the unified in the last instance theory of thought and computing, because each and every single time determines the blending of acting and not acting, and above all, a non-consistency between all the performed of science and philosophy. So radical immanence for Laruelle is devoid of subjectivity, but not of lived experience. That is, what distinguishes radical immanence from a machine, as when the latter remains yet again a simulation of man, a placeholder for automated intelligence that is there to sustain the superiority of philosophy. If automation is what presupposes this auto-functional functionality, which is already decided by the performance of intelligent machine, then the unimaton is the performed that corresponds to a practice or determination in the last instance. Non-philosophical practice, therefore, coincides with the unimaton that already brings forward and help us to develop and work with a radicalization of instrumentality. So not only a perform without performativity, but also an instrumentality without instrumentalization, or what Fred Moten calls non-instrumentalist instrumentalism. Fred Moten views here may contribute to help us to engender this argument against the transcendental pillars of AI, namely relying on this mirror image between human and machine, by addressing what he discusses as the instrumental sociality of things in common. And that was a quote. Moten points out that if the ethical foundation of the abolition of slavery, including the prohibition of torture, have universally relied on the categorical imperative, namely that no human should be used as, and quote, merely as means or tool, because every human was granted, and quote, the autonomy of his freedom, and quote, then he asks, what kind of ethical stances can be offered to those whose historical experience, intellectual tradition, and aesthetically performed are rather epistemologically defined, but their being as mere means? So what kind of ethic is possible when the condition of the servo-mechanic performed of the slave is always already a mere means? The unimatum can also be envisioned here as a non-axiomatic axiomatics that prevents instrumentality to fall back into the ontological claim of being, of nothingness, of the multiple, as well as the logical finite set of intuitive space and symbolic reality. So these are all the things that an instrumentality that bears in mind this instrumental sociality of things in common must refuse. This ontological claim of being, nothingness, the multiple, the logical finite sets of intuitive space and symbolic reality. As Laruelle insists, the program of non-philosophy should not be confused with the reality of the material world. Not only matter does not coincide with syntax, but also syntactical structures cannot prescribe semantics. In other words, this non-consistent immanence defies the temptation of taking non-philosophy as the model of automated thought. because this would just merely reposit a new transcendent order to both a philosophy and machine. Instead, when the radical immanence of the material is posit, Laruelle explained, as much as materials vary, so too the rules of syntax change, but not in a reversible fashion. So in the last instance stands for each time, one time each time. That is not about the gestalt change that occurs once and for all. That's what it means by the non-consistency of immanence, which entails, as it were, real negative infinities, one in each time entering without creating thought. Laruelle thus clarifies that the non-philosophy is a machine that is each time singularized, qua machine, but what information enters into it. But what does it mean that the unification of thought and computation, this unimatum, can actually help us to rethink, radicalize instrumentality without instrumentalism? It would be myopic to take the unilateral unification of the unimatum as yet another instance of sublimation of an absolute outside or an absolute contingency or an unreachable horizon that can be approached only by a new form of the sensible or new kind of ontologically gathering of human and machines. As opposed to the onto-epistemological predicament of artificial intelligence based on this biological principle of adaptation, survival, and selection, we have here the need of rearticulating the entire question of technology. One that argues for a refusal of the principle of liberation and freedom based on the overrepresentation of a servo-mechanic epistemology of machines. What is at stake here is the attempt to elaborate the unimatum in terms of socio-techno-genic conditions of blackness, entailing the non-philosophical elaboration of immanence, the non-being and negative axiomatic or non-adaptive cognition, and non-heteronomously and non-conscious behavior, and beyond the essentialist view of a racialized capital and its ethnocentric and anthropomorphic description of technology. If we turn to Denise Ferreira da Silva, for instance, she explains that the juridical and economical matrix of the ontological project grants a transcendental field of value where blackness as a category of racial difference, and quote, occludes the total balance necessary for the expropriation of the colonial expropriation of a violence that was authorized by modern juridical forms, namely conquest, displacement, and settlement, and property, i.e. enslavement. When the pillars of this transcendental field of value coincide with while the pillars of this transcendental field of value coincide with biocentric epistemology of economic success, Da Silva rather turns to the indeterminacy of the condition of enslavement described by quantum physics, involving technoscientific descriptions of matter as entailing how sociogenic matters remains the negative condition that rather allows the equivalence of value. Drawing on quantum mechanics, Ferreira da Silva argues that, and quote, deployed as a method, blackness fractures the glassy walls of universality understood as a formal determination, end quote. She proposes an experiment in articulating the equation of value as a self-determining formalism based upon and through, and defined by and through the violence against blackness. Ferreira da Silva carries out this algebraic experiment not only and simply to unveil the formal determination of matter, how form determines matter as a fundamental principle of the establishment, the recursive reiteration of the equation of value, but also to argue for the nullification of form without the universality of value. To do so, she proposes an ethical and ethico-political rearticulation of blackness that does not follow the image of man, whose program overfits, that is, overrepresents all modes of being human, on the one hand, and also makes to claim a claim for an absolute outside that separates the modern European white human from the non-modern, non-European, black, non-human. So the Silva ethical experiment offers us a proof of the equation of value, for which blackness has nothing, at zero value, as the creative capacity to unsettle modern Western onto-epistemology. Here, zero is to be taken not as a contradiction with one, as established by this dialectic of presence and absence, but itself as a signal of negation and as a signal of the negative. Instead of being invisible as something that has to be made visible and recursively reproduced or readapted as contingency within the system, blackness here stands for exenogenic, exenogenic without formal form, as if it were in a quantum vacuum of the machine. But how to demonstrate that such nullification is not simply another fetishization of the negative, for which we are waiting for another synthesis and another resolution, so that to reestablish the authority of transcendental thought. This is a question that must accompany the theorization of how negative instrumentality at the core can be at the core of generative AI, and in order to challenge what can be inscribed within the performance of science, of information, whereby the alienness or the xenonness of the machine is constantly resubsumed in representational metaphysics. For Da Silva, it is a question of rearticulating the mathematical mapping of the matrix of ethics in terms of a radical engagement with zero as a value in itself, rather than self-positing a critique that reveals the contradiction in the equation of value between 0 and 1. And as much as the results of the Silva experiment with the equation of value points to the real the dimension of the indeterminable, it also has zero value because it exists in a vacuum from philosophy, rather than it exists as an expansion of philosophy. But to answer this question in order to expand on this puzzle, we could possibly draw some ideas, some help from Gilbert Simondon. We know that Gilbert Simondon points that an infotechnical mentality envelops energy and information within feedback functions as much as patternless information that can expose not the systematic nature of knowledge, but the fractalizing and asymmetric techno-socio-genic form as incomplete. From his perspective, parts and points of interaction do not correspond to a static arrangement of sequential functions. On the contrary, points are spatiotemporal complexity that cannot be explained by one domain, but rather generate singular phenomena without originary reference to formal categories or material essences. Importantly, one may need to emphasize that the generative AI logic cannot predetermine the structure of rules because it's itself the result of interactive functions sustaining the operation of algorithmic compression. For instance, in as much as generative AI, such as the deep learning algorithm and the generative adversarial network or ChatGPT is conditioned by recursive complexity of layers, the algorithmic compression of randomness. It is also an operation for learning and structuring patterns in the last instance of the computational process. It is here where this last instance, this unimatum that I was talking about before, could also be set in conversation with Simondon theory of conversation or alagmatics, which brings together the functional operation of algorithmic compression of randomness with the structure of computational logic and pushes this kind of forms of knowledge towards a third epistemological xenosynthesis, a non-axiomatic epistemology, which is not just another instance of another onto-epistemology, but rather is the manifestation of a negation that the radical unimaton brings forward together with its socio-techno-genic practices. But what is it that holds this functional structure of the socio-techno-genic praxis? As we has already demonstrated in his attempt to systematically reconfigure and rethink cybernetics in terms of metaphysics, it is the recursive function that describes the circular qualities of self-reflectivities in terms of feedback, and establish the system of rules which has come to depend on its capacity to adapt to contingency. This indeterminacy is not unknown, but becomes part of the recursive loop of adaptability, for where the principle of recursivity in natural philosophy demarcates a historical route for both modern philosophy and cybernetics as models that confront the irregularities of nature. In particular, recursive self-reflectivity is embedded in the epistemological vision of natural sciences of the 18th century that explained the world from the standpoint of the organism. However, where efforts to reconstruct the biological or the natural lineage of self-reflective systematic thinking, moving from natural philosophy conception of the organism to arguments for organicism and organology, are also possibility that are not grounded in functions and mechanical parts, but in the temporality of autopoiesis and self-organization. Where account of contingency is the effort to address epistemology beyond the model of calculation and probability thinking. This is also an effort to engage the unknown in terms of the incalculable, namely a dimension of the real that cannot be subsumed to the paradigm or the paradigmatic universality of computation of AI as it stands today, or capital AI, which I did refer before. However, one can also argue that the recursive function of self-reflection is a schema that must preserve the mode of selective decision, but also the negative subjection of contingency, because what is external to the system must become a source of its interiority. In other words, insofar as the question of the unknown is also a problem for power, for this colonial racial patriarchal structure of re-employing the zero, re-employing contingency as a source, contingency seem to me that are yet bound to maintain and to always sustain the onto-epistemological recursivity of philosophy and of the equation of value, which again reiterates this image of servo-mechanic AI. So one could ask you, how can the incalculable, as we discusses it, avoid being placed as the negative source and the fuel that subtends the overrepresented form of reason at the core of patriarchal, colonial, and racial capital? How can the incalculable avoid becoming yet another sublimation of indeterminacy, which, by playing the role of the limit of self-reflectivity, precisely affords the dominance of self-reflective recursivity? So how can the programmable become related to the incalculable without subjecting the latter to the natural philosophical onto-epistemology that uses techno-flesh as a source to reproduce its originary cosmogony? Perhaps following views of the incalculable, this condition of for the innumerable could offer us a critical proposition for another kind of cybernetics, one based or aspiring to an abolitionist proposition of instrumentality. The scope here is not simply to open up automation beyond the calculable, but rather to consider the socio-techno-genic principle of AI rooted in the servo-mechanic model of cybernetics, and to rather produce a theory or propose a theory of instrumentality that challenges this overrepresented view of the medium as an extension of thought, power, dominance, surveillance, governance. And the network of value extraction and commodity exchange. While this articulation of instrumentality are indebted to the fundamentals of critical theory, i.e. the critique of instrumental reason, the efforts to radicalize the epistemological enterprise beyond the biocentric cognitive model of the medium requires a theory of automation that radicalizes not only the incalculable, but also instrumentality as the servo-mechanic flesh insurging against and within and the break of recursive epistemology. But how can a theory of instrumentality offer an envisioning of AI that, again, does not rely on the endomorphism of form and matter, this servo-mechanic model that sustain symbolic representation and material extraction, self-reflective reason, and task-oriented intelligence? To what extent can a medium without ontology help us to point to this kind of negative cybernetics? So the unimatum, one could argue, turns into a super collider reaction of intelligent machine, undivided flesh, blackness, surrogacy, fungibility, depth, refusal, fugitivity, extraction. So the unimatum in the last instance occurs in this space of otherness, which is not set up to build a negation between being and non-being, but rather build a negative space for artificial intelligence, as exposing the real fractalities in the recursive self-reflectivity and self-reflective systems of being and thought. Thank you very much.